Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for some of you. Welcome back to Sunday School. We're here today with Kelsey Green and myself from Complex Trauma Canada. We're going to be talking about healing hidden wounds. I'm glad that you're all here. Glad you could make it. And as discussed before, we will kind of, after the seminar is done or after the presentation is done, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. As you know, this is being recorded and this will be posted on Mansion. And in addition to that, the presentation is the only component that's going to be recorded. So no stress about names or faces being disclosed. But once we get into the Q&A, feel free to turn your cameras back on, turn your mics on, and use the hand raise function to start the questions. And I'll do my best to manage both questions in order and questions in the chat. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kelsey. Go ahead, man.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you all for sharing space here today. I'm going to see if I can get the technology to work, and hopefully that brings up the presentation for everybody.
You're good.
See it up there? Okay, great. So today we're going to talk about trauma, and what we've done is we've put a lot in here about trauma. So I'm going to try to go quickly, but we've got adequate time at the end that we can answer questions. And with this being posted, it is also something that you can go back and refer to later on. So we've put a little bit extra in there. But what we want to, it's going to work. There we go. What we're discussing today is not medical advice. Is not intended to cause distress, but there may be some people who do experience some trauma triggers going through some of this. If you do become triggered, please seek a way to ground yourself. That's a way to sort of bring yourself back to the present. If you need to, reach out for some help, or if you need to seek medical attention. But we're really not intending to trigger anybody today. We're trying to provide some information around trauma, information that is going to be of interest or maybe of interest to people. So a lot of trauma is really about things getting stuck inside of us. So it's a quote by Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, a terrific book if you haven't had a chance to read it. As long as you keep your secrets and suppress information, you are fundamentally at war with yourself. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know. That takes an enormous amount of courage. So in healing trauma, it is really about getting to know ourselves better and understand the parts of us that are deep inside. So our presentation today, we're going to really focus on trauma, and we're going to talk about 5 different aspects. We're going to look at what is trauma and what can be done. We are going to touch on adverse childhood experiences because a large percentage of the population has had adverse childhood experiences, and what we find is they come out later in life. We're also going to talk on attachments, and specifically the dynamic maturation model of attachments. I think a lot of people understand attachments, but the DMM may be new to some people. We're also going to talk about traumatic stress and PTSD, what that means. And then we're going to look and we're going to focus at the end of this on healing and post-traumatic growth. With every extremely difficult situation, there is an opportunity for growth to occur afterwards. So we want to really touch on that. So trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. And this is from a trauma expert, Dr. Gabor Mate. He's got a number of books that are terrific on trauma. Now, where are some of the places that trauma comes from? Well, the government has already recognized that workplace and armed conflict trauma is very prevalent in our society. We often see that child abuse and neglect or maltreatment can lead to trauma. But there's other areas too. There's accidents or emergencies that trauma can result from critical incidents. We also see intimate partner violence or domestic violence as a form of trauma in our society. And additionally, we're seeing more research into the area of legal and administrative aggression or abuse, which often leads to significant levels of trauma. And finally, another area that we'd like to highlight is the traumas from one person can be referred on to somebody else. So you can actually get traumas from interacting and relating to other people who have trauma. And I think a lot of people can understand that. But what is trauma? Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event that overwhelms our coping strategies. So it's trauma is something that just overwhelms us. And something that overwhelming experience can come from any of these areas or a number of other areas that exist as well. When you have trauma, often it's not just the trauma that maybe occurs when you're an adult, but it's sort of a reinforcement between your childhood trauma, your adult trauma, and then the triggering environment or the situation that you're in. They need all of these things to occur. And when they do, you can gain or have what's often called trauma activation. And a lot of people understand what trauma activation is. They may be unable to focus or maybe unable to really remember what's happening in the moment. This is really where we get into that fight or flight response that we have as human beings. Sometimes we get quick to anger or quick to push people away. Some people start shaking, feeling unsafe, and they can run away or freeze in place. Now, when trauma is activated, the first thing that we need to do is really understand what grounding is and how to pull ourselves out of that activation and settle. And sometimes that can take time. It's not uncommon for a really serious trauma activation or even a moderate trauma activation to take more than a day, maybe even a few days to really settle back down to your normal self. But grounding can be done in ways by looking around and hearing what's in your environment, thinking about, what are 10 sounds you can hear right now? Or thinking about what are 10 things I can see right now? Some people like to put their bare feet on the ground or in the grass, or maybe go for a walk and see what's around them. Grounding is about bringing us back to the present, where trauma activation takes us back into the past. So grounding is an important skill to learn. And I really encourage everyone to understand what grounding is for them and what works for them. Because the grounding that works for one person may not work for another person. So with trauma, there's four or really five F's of trauma that we like to talk about. The first are our responses to trauma. First, we go into fight or flight. And those responses are when there is some kind of event, traumatic event, we want to fight it off or we want to run away from it. But sometimes those don't work. Sometimes we can't fight off a traumatic event. And in those cases, we often move into the freeze or fawn situation where we more become paralyzed or we sort of walk on eggshells trying to make it okay for the other person or the others or what's happening in the situation. With with freeze or fawn, we often start to pack down those traumas inside of us, and that can actually lead to a buildup of trauma within us. With trauma, we often have flashbacks. I think a lot of people have seen movies like Rambo, where Rambo was having flashbacks where he was physically and psychologically remembering what happened in the war. But flashbacks don't have to be always a physical flashback. They can often be just an emotional flashback. So our emotions are actually going back to where they were at the time of the traumatic event. When we think about depression and anxiety, because those are often associated in some way with trauma, depression is really about thinking to the past and remembering what happened in the past, whereas anxiety is looking to the future. So when we get into treatment and we start processing our traumas, we're not only helping the trauma itself, we're helping the depressive reactions from the past, and we're helping the anxiety associated with the potential risk in the future. Trauma is not the same for everyone. What traumatizes one person may not be traumatizing to somebody else, and that's okay. It's never a competition around trauma, but understanding that different things impact people in different ways. The conventional or the more traditional approaches to treating trauma have been a combination of therapy and medication. And we're not going to get too far into the medication today. But there are a number of different medications that are sometimes used, and most of those are very current. And you can talk about your doctor with them. There's certain medication that can be used to increase serotonin or increase dopamine levels, but other ones that'll help with nightmares. There's also different approaches to group therapy, whether that's a peer support group or support group for Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Parental Alienation Anonymous. Peer support groups or support groups are known to also be beneficial for people with trauma. There are a number of trauma-focused therapies, and we're going to talk about cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, one called EMDR that we're going to touch on here. And then there's some evolution in the psychedelic-assisted therapy, and there's complementary therapy as well, whether there's music or art or activity. Other people find benefit from doing movement-based therapies or treatments, Tai Chi or yoga, to get the body moving, to help move energy around. That can be very helpful. Meditation is often recommended for people with trauma to help calm the nervous system. But there are some people that when they try meditation and they have trauma, they actually get more activated. So it may or may not be a modality, but it's something that's often recommended. And then there's massage and acupuncture as well. So when we come to trauma therapies, there's sort of three that are recommended by the USVA. The first one is cognitive processing therapy. It's a type of cognitive behavioral therapy. It can work for some people, but it's often way too triggering. Prolonged exposure therapy is about taking you back there in a talk therapy approach to help gradually process the memories. Some people find that triggering as well. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it's a treatment where the therapist is often moving their finger back and forth, and you're moving with your eyes, similar to how you might be functioning in REM sleep at night. And that helps to process the traumas as well. So if you're experiencing trauma or have experienced trauma, EMDR might be something that could be quite helpful for you. There is an adage that says that you can't treat trauma while you're in trauma. And that's really challenging for a lot of people because when they realize they're experiencing trauma or have experienced trauma, they're in the middle of a really serious situation that is causing more trauma. And what we're finding from research out of the UK is that EMDR does have benefits in those situations. So if you're in a really stressful situation and if you can get access to EMDR, it's something to really consider. But treatment and therapy is really changing, it's evolving, and we're now seeing more and more research into psychedelic-assisted therapy. The studies that have come out are really showing promising results, and there's generally 3 different types of psychedelics that are considered. The key point here is that psychedelics are used to assist or to help therapy, not just used for recreational purposes. They're used in the presence of a trained expert who can help facilitate the therapy. The first one is psilocybin. There's really little or no evidence that microdosing provides a long-term benefit. Those do take a number of sessions, and they're done with therapy. They're often done with music and other stimulation as well. Ketamine really helps one to dissociate away from the trauma. Again, it's a number of sessions. They're still, with psilocybin and ketamine, they're still trying to figure out what is the best approach to therapy, what is the best therapy to do. With MDMA, there is quite a bit of research, and it's not something that we can access in Canada right now, but there have been trials here. Talk therapy, which is usually not used in trauma therapy because it's too activating, is quite effective with MDMA therapy. And they're finding that often with 1 or 2 sessions, people are seeing a dramatic increase in trauma symptoms, including with PTSD. When doing any of these psychedelics, they should be done at a certified facility with people in place to monitor for safety. But there's other things that can also help. They can talk to them about as complementary therapy or complementary treatment. Things like some people are very musical and very talented, and music therapy can be beneficial, or art therapy. For children with trauma, They talk more about play therapy with kids. Kids will sort of reenact the traumatic situations and can help process some of it through play therapy. There's also activity therapy, getting out and getting involved, maybe playing a sport or an activity, going on walks with others who are maybe in a peer support group or in another environment. When it comes to peer support, there's one-on-one peer support, there's group peer support, and there's action peer support. Each one has a different focus, and depending on where you are, there may be one that's better or maybe not quite the right timing for one for where you are. Another part to think about is family systems therapy, and this is maybe if you're in a situation where there is some family systems issues. That might be an alienation, it might be domestic abuse. Family systems can be beneficial in helping to understand and process traumas from family systems. It may also provide you some insights into your childhood, if there was any challenges in your childhood. Another great quote by Gabor Mate as we move into adverse childhood experiences is that children don't get traumatized because they are hurt. They get traumatized because they're alone with the hurt. If children don't have proper supports, that hurt can really go right through them and stick with them. So the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, about 25 years ago, did a study in the US where they looked at a huge number of children and they looked at what are called adverse childhood experiences. So if you are interested, you can look up ACE's study and you will find a lot of information about it. But some of the key findings were that 58% of people had at least two types of childhood traumas or childhood adverse experiences. And other work that's progressed since then has talked about how psychological abuse and neglect are at least as bad, if not worse, than physical and sexual abuse. So there's another significant adverse childhood experience, which isn't entirely captured in the adverse childhood experiences. But what they did find is that there is a very strong relationship between exposure to abuse and household dysfunction in children with serious impacts in adulthood. So what happens in your childhood echoes through your life and you can experience in your adulthood. This can lead to things like mood or personality disorders. They can lead to substance abuse. It can actually even lead to physical health problems like obesity or heart disease, autoimmune disorders. Those are all really hot areas for looking at childhood trauma now. And they're finding that if you can resolve and treat the childhood trauma, sometimes autoimmune disorders start to resolve themselves. What they also found in that study is that childhood trauma actually increases the risk of self-harm and suicide and death in people. And those are for different reasons, but they're all findings of the ACEs study. So they looked at three sort of different things in that study. The first was the risk factors. What are the things that the children had in common in developing childhood trauma? And what were the things that actually prevented them from going worse? First was they're sort of broken down into two categories, families and communities. Having a challenging family or a challenging community will increase your risk of adverse childhood experiences, just like having a caring or a stable or nurturing family or nurturing community will add to protective factors. Now, just because someone lives in a challenging family or a challenging community doesn't mean that they will get adverse childhood experiences that will stay with them. But these were just some of the risk factors or protective factors that were found. The question comes up, why is childhood trauma, why does it have such an impact on us? And we go back to some really fundamental stuff. As children, we're really growing and learning strategies to cope and function in the world. We're learning how the world works and how we can function in it. And adverse experiences require us to adapt and develop specific strategies to deal with those challenging or more extreme events. Our strategies that we develop become the foundation of we function and cope in the world around us as adults. And the strategies that we develop in childhood, they may work very well in childhood, but they may not work in adulthood. and some of them may actually be harmful in adulthood. So it's not to say that we can't develop and learn new strategies on how to cope with and function in the world, but it becomes more difficult as an adult when we have to learn new strategies. But it's not impossible. So now we're going to get into attachments, and Patricia Crittenden is instrumental in one of the models of attachments. And a great quote for her is that attachment isn't the problem. Danger is the problem, and attachment is the solution. We create attachments to our parents, family members, loved ones, to deal with danger or threats. So if you haven't heard about attachments before, our understanding of attachments really started to grow when a guy named John Bowlby started to look into attachments. And he looked into the connections between young children under about 5 years old and their parents. He wrote quite extensively on this from the 60s to about the 90s. And one of the things he came up with was about attachment and loss was a big part of his work, or grieving. And I think we all at some point have to grieve different things in our lives. But he also noted the lifelong impacts of family systems and attachments dysfunctions. And other people went in to look into family systems, but one of his colleagues, Mary Ainsworth, was sort of kept his attachment research going. She focused really on mothers and children, and she helped to develop what a lot of us know as the ABC plus D model of attachment. So we might know about secure attachments, insecure, or disorganized attachments. Patricia Crittenden took that work and she built onto it, and she created what's called the dynamic maturation model of attachments. What Mary Ainsworth found was that there were people and there was attachment styles that didn't fit into her 4 categories, but she didn't have a place to put them. And the work that Patricia Crittenden did really explored that in more detail. So the dynamic maturation model looks at how we cope and what are our strategies for functioning throughout our life. The upper one there is in preschool. So in preschool, we have certain strategies that are very healthy, but we start to develop the capacity in our brains and our bodies to develop strategies, that aren't quite as healthy. And the lower one is in adolescence. So you can see as children age and as we age into adulthood, we grow the ability to develop more adaptive strategies. And some of these strategies aren't as healthy or aren't as beneficial in all situations. And where we see this happening quite a bit is when the source of comfort is also the source of terror, because children aren't quite sure how to attach anymore. So Bessel van der Kolk says that terror increases the need for attachment, even if the source of comfort is also the source of terror. So in a child, that can be very challenging to understand. This is the full dynamic maturation model in adulthood. The B's, B1 to B5 across the top, those are the balance strategies. On the A side, going down from A1 to A7-8, with numbers of the A's being more challenging strategies or more maladaptive strategies as you get down towards 7-8. Those strategies may have worked very well in certain situations growing up, but they're not as well adapted to our society that we have today. The A side is where people start to reject affect or feeling, and they become more cognitive. And then on the C side, from C1 to C8, people start to reject cognition or critical thinking, and they become more driven by their emotions. And right at the bottom is AC, which is often defined as psychopathology, psychopathy. So it's a very challenging set of strategies that someone uses there. But what do attachments impact? We all have them, but attachment traumas really are complex traumas because they go right through us and they affect us in ways that we don't always understand. So complex traumas not only impact our own sense of self, but they impact our loved ones and our friendships. And then greater than that, they impact our connections with our communities and our society. So when our attachments are traumatized, it's not just us that experiences it. It's the way that we connect to ourselves and the world around us. Within the depths of healing from complex trauma, you'll discover an inner strength that can move mountains and mend hearts. So there's various types of traumatic stress injuries that can occur when the stress or the trauma becomes so great that it has an impact on you. The first type is what's called acute stress. So that's stress in the moment, right now happening at a certain moment. The next one is post-traumatic stress. So as this name sounds, that's stress that's a situation where after the stress, after the traumatic stress, we carry with us traumas from that. And then there's another form called the complex stress or complex post-traumatic stress. If these reach a certain threshold, they can be diagnosed either in the DSM manual or in the ICD manual. There's different diagnostic criteria, and we'll talk about the ones for PTSD here in a moment. The research from Canada shows that 9.2% of Canadians have PTSD. It's quite a large number, but it's also not a huge number at the same time. Another thing to bear in mind is that children also experience PTSD, but they experience it in different ways than adults do. In order to be diagnosed with PTSD, there are 5 core elements that need to occur. First, there needs to be exposure to an actual or threatened death, a serious injury, or violence. Now, that can be intimate partner violence. It can be a threat or a serious injury to a loved one. Doesn't have to be to you, but it has to have occurred. There needs to be the presence of at least one intrusion symptom, and we're going to talk about those in a minute, and that's associated with the event. There needs to be persistent avoidant of stimuli. So you're trying to avoid the bad things that happened. There is negative alterations to cognition. That means that the way you think about things has changed, often becoming more vigilant or aware of potential danger around you. And then there's also changes in arousal or reactivity. So you may get triggered and trauma activated. So if those 5 things are occurring together, it may be that you are experiencing PTSD. So we talk about intrusive memories. I'll just go through a couple of these quickly. They're really unwanted or distressing memories. They can come up during trauma activation or other times, and they can have physical manifestations of those memories as well as emotional. Avoidance means really trying not to think or feel the event that happened. It is often avoiding places or activities that occurred where those traumatic events occurred. Negative changes in thinking and mood can include negative thoughts about ourselves or about the world. It can sometimes include being hopeless. Sometimes our memories don't form like they used to. And often there's an impact to our families and our friends and our relationships. Or maybe you lose interest in an activity that you enjoyed. There's also physical and emotional reactions. This can be easily startled or frightened, being on guard for danger. It can also be self-destructive behavior. There may be some angry outbursts or some guilt or shame. And guilt and shame is often seen in children, where children take the trauma into themselves much more, and they say, the world around me has to be okay, so I must be the bad thing in the situation. So when dealing with children with trauma, that is an important part to touch on. Just a few symptoms of PTSD and complex PTSD, nervousness, agitation, but there's also somatic experiences like headaches, maybe depression or crying spells, mood swings, sometimes shakiness. That can be one as well. And I think we all know about the sleep disturbances and nightmares. PTSD is a little bit different. There's more difficulty controlling emotions. There's often an anger, mistrust towards the world. Sometimes it's feeling hopeless, or sometimes it's feeling worthless. Um, there's often a lot of avoiding friendships or relationships as well. Um, and these somatic feelings, or feelings in the body, like headaches, dizziness, chest pain, even narrowing of the vision, or stomach aches, can be associated with PTSD or complex PTSD. Another one that comes up is suicidal thoughts or attempts. Um, with the research shows that with just PTSD, that is not something that generally occurs. But with complex PTSD or PTSD and other things like depression, those can happen. And it's my belief that we need to talk about those so that we can understand they do occur for people and we can help each other. One more thing that's worth noting here too, and is just about moral injuries, because moral injuries are sometimes confused as PTSD, but they're not. And because of that, they can't be treated the same way. So moral injuries are a breach of your morals in a serious situation by someone in a position of authority. And the first good news is that if you have a moral injury, it means you have morals and you have values and you have ethics. But that can lead to challenges. So with moral injuries, there's a lot of overlap here. Um, but the emotions are different, and what is lost is different. So the main painful emotions in complex PTSD, they're fear and shame and rage and despair. Um, and moral injuries, they're more guilt and shame and anger. Um, what's lost when you have complex PTSD is your time, it's your self-trust, and it's often your voice being able to speak up. With PTSD, generally what's lost is really just considered safety. You don't feel safe in the world anymore. And with moral injuries, it's not safety as much as it is trust. And there is a difference there. Something else to consider, as some people may want to look into that. Um, in the same way that people can drive each other mad, the company of people and being understood by people can also heal us. And this is from Bessel van der Kolk as well. So we're going to look here now at healing and post-traumatic growth. And we're wrapping up here shortly. So generally, they talk about 4 stages of trauma recovery. But there's also a fifth one that jumps in there sometimes. So we're going to talk about all 5. The first phase is safety and stabilization. This is a stage where the traumas have just recently occurred or may still be occurring. You may feel angry, you may feel fearful, you may be in denial of what's happening. The first step is to help ensure that the person is physically safe and then emotionally or psychologically safe, and help to stabilize those emotions. This first stage is where learning and teaching grounding skills and regulation of your emotions are very important. The next stage is remembering what happened, mourning it or grieving it, and working towards detaching from it. This is where you're telling the story. People tell the story of the trauma separate from them. This is something that happened, but this isn't who I am in total. And trying to make meaning of what happened and of the emotions, and starting to reclaim and transform those memories for yourself. And the third stage is reconnection and integration. It's recognizing the impact that that event had, reconnecting with our own lives and our sense of self, and finding meaning in what we're doing and who we are. To recognize, and I think this is very important, trauma is part of me, but it is not all of me. It's often that in the early stages of healing that we're jumping around between these different stages at different times. It's not you have to finish 1 and go to 2 and then 2 into 3. It's often that one day we'll be in 3 and then something happens and we'll be back in 1, and then maybe we'll move to 2. But as you work through those, there's often comes a day where you say, look, I've learned from what's happened. And you start to understand things in a different way. And that's when we get to see that you're in the post-traumatic growth stage. A stage where you've been empowered yourself to move forward. You've redefined your life. Maybe you've got a new mission in life, or you've developed new goals for yourself. You're seeing new possibility. You're seeing your strengths and the values that you bring to the world. And maybe you've defined a new sense of purpose for yourself. That phase will often sneak up on people. They don't really realize they're doing it. And then when they look back, they say, look how much I've grown and changed. And the final phase, which is often part of people with trauma's lives, is really maintaining it and reducing the trauma, continuing the self-care, recognizing that there may be other triggers or other activation that occurs with you, and recognizing it and dealing with it. And then continuing to process traumas as they occur, because they will continue to occur over your life. Now, just to give a sense of what healing is like in these different aspects, the biological, the psychological, the social, and the spiritual aspects, when you see trauma healing in the biological, you may not actually see this, but the brain chemicals are starting to balance themselves out. You're going to find a better way to stay active, but also take time for self-care. You're going to be more accepting of physical touch. You're going to reduce those unwanted somatic or body sensations, and you're going to find ways to better manage the triggers. Psychologically, you're going to reduce the anxiety and the scattered thinking. You're going to have an increased sense of safety. Shame, anger, rage will all start to disappear, or maybe not disappear, but to be more managed in an appropriate way. Having anger is a normal human emotion, and we should have it, but to manage it in an appropriate way. And you'll also really start to remember that you are worthy as an individual. You are a worthy human being. Social, when you start to heal, you'll start to connect with, maybe you'll connect with new friends, and you'll build new friendships. You'll often, people who are recovering from trauma, find ways to understand others in a different way than ever before, and maybe even helping those people as well. But also connecting with others and ourselves in healthier ways and with more compassion. And it often results to building some new community. And spiritually, and spiritual is different for everybody, but this is a purpose of finding a mission or goals for your future, feeling connected to the world again in a different way, and really recalling the feelings of joy and love that you have. So just to conclude here, post-traumatic growth does happen, and it is something that we can all achieve. And Peter Levine, who has written a number of books on trauma, one of his great quotes is, "Trauma is a fact of life. It does not, however, have to be a life sentence." And he's absolutely right that we can heal and actually grow from the traumas we've experienced. We've got a few tools and potential supports here that we've referenced in in the presentation. If you're interested in doing a screening tool for anxiety or depression or PTSD, the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, if you search that, you can go in and there's actually a screening tool, or if you could put that link in. I think these links are going to be shared later on as well. So there's a few links there that you might find helpful. And at that point, I think we're through the presentation. Thank you all for your time today, and hope that you've learned something or have some questions.
That's great, Kelsey. Thank you very much. Do you mind just flipping off the screen share for a second, please? Perfect. So before we get to the Q&A, there's a couple of housekeeping items. One, in kind of section 2 of the presentation, Kelsey talked about the ACE index quiz, or the ACE index. If you want to do the ACE index for either yourself or your kids, I'm putting a link in the chat right now to the ACE index. It lives on Complex Trauma Canada. You can do it anonymously, or you can do it if you want the results submitted back to you. We can certainly accommodate that as well. Kelsey talked about a couple of screening tools. We also have a PTSD screening tool. If you think you may have been suffering PTSD or may have suffered PTSD, but you haven't been diagnosed yet, this is one way that you can kind of do a little bit of kind of self-assessment first. And I'll put that in the chat as well. And again, I'll email you all these links in a follow-up email after the webinar. So if you're really chomping at the bit and you want to get at it right away, then please, feel free to copy them from the chat. But I will send you a link with the books that Kelsey referenced, The Body Keeps the Score, and some books from Dr. Gabor Mate if you want to do some further research in a follow-up email. As I mentioned earlier, Complex Trauma Canada has a membership benefits area with a 7-day self-care roadmap along with family law and criminal law and parental alienation resources. This content is updated regularly with current research, case law, and podcasts. If you're able to support our research at $9 a month, we would sincerely appreciate it, but neither Kelsey nor myself want money to get in the way of your healing and access to resources. So if the cost is prohibitive, you can just reply to that email and I'll give you access to the members area at no charge. And with that, we will open the floor to discussion. I see we've got some hands up already. So thank you very much for that. I'm just going to figure out a way to stop the recording and we'll go to Q&A. Thanks very much, Kelsey. That was awesome.